Greetings. Occasionally on social media, one comes across the claim that the 12th century Syrian Orthodox bishop Dionysius Bar Salibi, or also called Jacob Bar Salibi, or either way, Bar Salibi, that Bar Salibi had said that the Feast of the Nativity, which is to say Christmas, was moved to the 25th of December to coincide with pagan celebrations of the sun, which took place on that day. Now, in years past, it has been my experience that those passing this claim around social media seem to never have a source for that claim. In my experience, many, when pressed for a source, at least some of these polemicists, many of these polemicists, will just reference a website which itself makes the claim unsourced. So if one does go through the different sources in print discussing this claim or a closely related claim, eventually one will get back to the Bibliothecae Orientalis, a work compiled by a brilliant Maronite scholar known as Yusuf or Giuseppe Assemani, who had moved from what is now Lebanon to Rome and spent decades compiling and cataloging Syriac, Arabic, Coptic, and Ge'ez manuscripts for the Vatican. Now, on your screen is volume 2 of that work, the Bibliothecae Orientalis, which is available online, and those who are interested can find a link to the work in the video description. Now, the relevant statement can be found on page 164. You'll notice this is a bilingual text with the original Syriac text and a Latin translation provided by Assemani. Zooming in on the relevant portion, the statement, which some attribute to Bar Salibi, can be found here. So, for example, you'll see Solemnitas ad die sextus Januarii ad vicesimus quintus Decembris translata fuit. The solemnity of the 6th of January was moved to the 25th of December. And then it follows with, for example, Solemne erat ethnicis Ḥaneftā die vicesimus quintus Decembris festum ortus solis celebrare. The solemnity of the 25th of December was when heathens or pagans celebrated the birth of the sun. Now, that's the Latin translation. People who quote this text on social media are passing around an English translation of that Latin text, and in something akin to a game of telephone, a key detail, which I'll touch on in a moment, has been lost for some. And before I get to that, if you're interested in the original Syriac text, which was being translated by that Latin text, you can see this portion here, which reads, Shahlepu abahuta lahe de eshta bekanun wa abruhu behamsha wa asrin bekanun kadmaya, which means they changed the reverence of the 6th of January and they transferred it to the 25th of December. And by the way, that word abruhu, the root there is ayin beit reish, which is the same root that's used in the word Hebrew in the sense of, one who crosses over. So to cross over, to transfer. Just wanted to point that out. By the way, quick technical note, the number of each day in the month is not written out. Rather, a letter or 2 letters is used. For 6, simply a wa is used, and for 25, simply kaf he is used. Right. So I suppose I could have read that as wa bekanun ahadi and kaf he bekanun kadmaya, respectively. Now, later in the same text, the word for 6, which is eshta, is written out, but I did not find an instance in this text of the word for 25 being written out. However, essentially the same phrase, hamsha wa asrin bekanun kadem, appears in the Peshitta translation of 1 Maccabees 4:59, which is what you see on your screen, though the text in Maccabees is referring to a month on the lunar calendar, while the text in the Bibliothecae Orientalis is referring to a month on the Roman solar calendar. Basically 2 different calendars, but the same month name, essentially. But that aside, getting back to the text we've been looking at, there is also this portion corresponding to the Latin we looked at, and it reads, Lehanfe ida de beit yalda de shebsha, de hawehua be hamsha we asrin be kanun kadim. To the heathens is the feast of the place of the birth of the sun, which was on the 25th of December. And by the way, another quick and interesting note, that word hanfe is the plural of Ḥanīf. And that Syriac word Ḥanīf is etymologically related to the Arabic word Ḥanīf. Now, some may recall that the Qur'an at sūrat al-MaseeHee 367 states that Abraham was neither a Jew nor a Christian, but rather a Ḥanīf. Both Syriac and Arabic use these respective terms as meaning something other than a Jew or a Christian, though the Syriac text often seem to intend the term in a pejorative or negative way, along the lines of, a heathen or a pagan, while clearly the Quran intends the corresponding Arabic term in a more benign or even positive sense, right? However, perhaps it's also worth noting that the Syriac term may not always be intended as a negative. For example, it's worth noting that the Peshitta in Mark 7:26 refers to the Syro-Phoenician woman as Ḥaneftā, which is the female Ḥanīf, female Ḥanīf in the feminine with the definite article. Getting back on topic, you have now seen the Syriac text, which some attribute to Bar Salibi. The question now should be, did Bar Salibi actually pen those words? It is here that it might be worthwhile to turn to Assemani's introduction to that text, which reads as follows: Unctamem armenorem ritum, quem hic regicit Bar Salibeus, anonymus nescio qui Sirus probare contendit in margine apud eundem Bar Salibeum. Which means, however, this right of the Armenians, which Bar Salibi rejects, an anonymous, unknown Syrian, right? Anonymus nescio qui Sirius, literally anonymous Syrian who I don't know. An anonymous, unknown Syrian tries to prove it in the margin at the same from Bar Salibi. In other words, the text we just looked at is not from Bar Salibi. It was a marginal note which someone else, someone unknown and anonymous, added to a manuscript which contained the writings of Bar Salibi. As Assemani notes, the text expressed an Armenian position which Bar Salibi actually rejected. Now, admittedly, some of the polemics out there note this, right? Some of these polemics that are online note that it goes back to a marginal note in a Bar Salibi text, and others refer to it as a quote-unquote scholiast on or a scholiast of Bar Salibi. And I suspect that the later confusion which resulted in those who thought this went back to Bar Salibi himself was due to, for example, some reading those secondary and tertiary references and assuming it must have meant that the marginal note was penned by Bar Salibi himself, or for those whose sources read, included the word scholiast, they might have assumed it meant a commentary by Bar Salibi himself rather than a commentary on the writings of Bar Salibi. But alas, no. The reality is that this was something of a polemical note written in the margins of a text by Bar Salibi as a way of expressing disagreement with Bar Salibi. That then raises the question, what was Bar Salibi's actual position, right? What did he hold? Well, Assemani shared this marginal note as an addendum to text from Bar Salibi, which you can find in the preceding pages. We can turn back a couple of pages to page 162 to find Bar Salibi's position on the nativity of Christ. Here he writes the following: Etile dein maran bechamsha we asrin bekanun kadim. Thus the Lord was born on the 25th of December. Metul dabhu zabna, because in that time, and then we need to turn to the next page where it continues, but remember that word zabna, and we pick up at the top of the first column of the next page. Zabna be mashre hua nura de nezke le chashuka. The time when it is weak, the light is victorious over the darkness. And then it continues, Kadmares hua de hu etawi nure de alma, as if implying that he exists as the light of the world. So Bar Salibi himself explicitly said that Christ was born on the 25th of December, and the timing was not lost on him. He saw God's decree that God be born at that time, at a time when the sun is seemingly at its weakest point, as conveying a significant meaning, as conveying the message of Christ, coming forward and from a point of weakness, but nonetheless triumphing over darkness. And you can also see this in Assemani's Latin translation of that text, which reads as follows: Natus est Dominus die vecissimus quintus Decembris. The Lord was born on the 25th of December. Quia eo tempore lux tenebras incipit superare. As at that time the light begins to overcome the darkness. Significans Dominum esse mundi lucem, signifying that the Lord is the light of the world. And there's more that Bar Salibi said that's interesting. Turning back to the Syriac text, we also find the following: Romi, Wecula Italia, Webe Palestini, which is to say Rome and all of Italy, and in Palestine, Minzabna de Shlicha Adma Layoman. Remember that phrase, Minzabna de Shlicha Adma Layoman, from the time of the apostles until our day, Behamsha wa asrin bekanun, on the 25th of December, and then it continues on to the next column. So again, reading that previous part as we go to the top of the next column, min zabna deshlicha adma leyoman behamsha wa asrin bekanun kadim meshtamela hua ida de yalda. On the 25th of December is celebrated the Feast of the Nativity, or putting it all together from the time of the apostles until our day. On the 25th of December is celebrated the Feast of the Nativity. And he goes on to mention everyone else adopting this practice, with the exception, a little bit of a clarification. He writes, setar men Armanie, aside from the Armenians. And he goes on to describe the Armenians as having crude minds and stiff necks, and of not being obedient to the truth. But the relevant point here is that not only did Bar Salibi believe that Christ was born on the 25th of December, but he even believed that the practice of celebrating the Nativity at that time went back to the apostles. And we can likewise find this in Assemani's Latin translation, which reads as follows: In provincia Romana et universa Italia et in Palestina, ab apostolorum evo usque ad hodiernum diem, Die 25 Decembris festum natalis Domini celebrator. In the provinces of Rome and all of Italia, and in Palestine, from the time of the apostles until our day, on the 25th day of December, the feast of the Nativity of the Lord is celebrated. So as I just said, Bar Salibi not only affirmed December 25th as the date for Christ's birth, but he said that the feast of the Nativity went back to the time of the apostles. Now, of course, you don't have to agree with Bar Salibi on that claim, but the point of this video is to be clear about Bar Salibi's actual position, precisely because there are polemics floating around social media stating the opposite, attributing to Bar Salibi the opposite of what he actually wrote. So irrespective of whether you agree or disagree with Bar Salibi, the point of this video is to be clear about his actual position and to provide the source from which these claims derive, or the source in which these claims can be found. That said, in wrapping this up, Bar Salibi mentioned that the practice was adopted by all the churches in the east and the north, and then he adds, si armenos excipias, if you exclude the Armenians, with the exception of the Armenians. Then he goes on to refer to those who do not hold to the 25th of December as homines crasse mentis et durae cervicis, qui non obedient veritati, men of crass minds and stiff necks who are not obedient to truth. And perhaps that sort of language inspired the polemical reply, which was ultimately slipped into the margin of one of his works. And that brings us to what comes next. Immediately below the translation of Bar Salibi's position, we see Assemani's introduction to the marginal note, which we already read earlier, which notes that where Bar Salibi rejected the Armenian position, some anonymous unknown author at a later date tried to argue for that position in the margins. And then you get the relevant text itself, of the text of the marginal note, which begins Kanuna Hari etiled maran in the Syriac and Menses Januario natus es Dominus in the Latin, both meaning roughly the Lord was born in January. Now, in closing, I know, or I suspect, that some will wish to declare something along the lines of, who cares what Bar Salibi thought? But to be fair, that was not the attitude of the modern polemicists on social media who claimed that Bar Salibi wrote the relevant text. In those social media posts, the tacit tone seemed to be along the lines of, Bar Salibi said it, therefore it's significant. If you personally never invoked Bar Salibi, that's fine. But for those who did, it seems a bit awkward to then try to turn around and wave him off as irrelevant when he affirms precisely that which they tried to quote him against. As for the anonymous unknown author of the marginal note, perhaps at most we can say that these sorts of polemics go at least as far back as the 12th century. But that in itself tells us nothing about the veracity of the relevant polemic. It's unclear why we should side with such a polemic. Moreover, for those who try to use this polemic to place Christ's birth outside of the winter, note that this marginal note amounted to one side in a disagreement between two factions which both proposed a winter date for Christ's birth. The marginal note proposed a date which was ultimately less than 2 weeks after the date which Bar Salibi affirmed. And perhaps it's worth mentioning that there are dates on the Hebrew calendar which can easily fall in late December one year and early January another year. And on that note, I'll close this here. I hope you found this brief attempt to clarify Bar Salibi's actual position interesting and educational. As always, I welcome any comments, questions, or criticisms. God bless.